Years ago, I remember a doctor telling me, "This is serious." It was a shock to me, as my wife was incredibly sick and we had a newborn daughter. It was a very revealing moment. I'd wanted so badly to be married and to have a family, and I'd waited longer than I really had wanted to get married, but I was grateful for the woman that God had put into my life, and I was so thankful for our daughter. But I was suddenly confronted with the thought that my hopes and my dreams, growing old together with my wife, raising our daughter together, being able to serve in the church together, it all could have disappeared in an instant. And all that I could think about were two types of people that Jesus talked about, and he compared them to two men who built their houses. This passage continues to be as true today as it was those days when I found myself cleaving to meaning and cleaving to something to hold on to during that difficult time in my life. And let's see what it has to say to us today. And a couple of things to start. This passage occurs at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 to 7. In the verses right before the passage today, Jesus discusses false prophets in the final judgment, which I think is relevant to what we'll talk about today. And this is important to note for verses 24 to 29. So let's read. "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." When Jesus finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. So the first thing to talk about today is the foolish person. So the foolish person, and Jesus says he hears Jesus' words, but he doesn't act on those words. And he compares that person to a foolish builder, whose house ultimately falls when there's a storm. And that man builds his house on sand, which we know is a bad foundation because sand is ever shifting. So when the storms and the rain comes, it would wash away the foundation and the house would crumble. So the foundation would be on something other than Christ. And this would be like saying this person believes in the creation over the creator, so their foundation could be being led astray by false prophets. Think about the wisdom of the age. There's a lot of people that are constantly peddling different products or different things or different ideas, and they could be following all of those. So they would listen to Jesus' words, or they would hear Jesus' words, but then they might say, "Oh, no, I prefer that religion and what they have to say," or "I prefer the idea of working really hard and then I'll take care of myself," or the self-help idea as well, or yoga, or who knows what else that's going to promise them maybe temporal fulfillment, but it's not going to be eternal. And so any of those things, they will have a foundation that will crumble as soon as any stress is applied to it. And so these are all the false messages of hope of today. And so maybe something interesting for you to think about is what would be some false messages of hope that you hear today in your life compared with the truth and the actual everlasting hope in the gospel or the good news of Christ. And so as Jesus talks about, the storm comes from all directions, regardless of if your hope is on government or your hope is on a group of people, your hope is on your own beauty. If you're young and you think you're going to live forever, I assure you, you will get old and your body will start to do things that you just can't imagine or can't believe. My back used to actually be nice, and now it seems like I have the back of an old man and my hair is falling out. So eventually you will go through these things too if you live long enough. And I once heard it applied to worship, that whatever you worship, you will basically die 1,000,000 times or more, because if you worship beauty or you put your trust in your beauty, it's not going to last, and you will wake up and you'll find a pimple, you'll wake up and you'll find some hair falling out, you'll wake up and find a gray hair, and you'll die that day to realize, and then you'll have to get surgery, and you'll just continually, through the rest of your life, die a little bit more each day because those things are not going to be a good foundation to build your life on. And at any moment, you could lose your entire beauty in a freak accident or something. Or in money, you could lose your money. And look at the Great Depression. Some people lost their life savings overnight, right? Or lost a lot of money overnight. In other countries, similar things have happened. Or your security in a war could happen, or a pandemic like we're going through right now with COVID. There is no security on this earth. Somebody once said that there are two things that are sure in this life, which are death and taxes, I think was what it was. And let's look at the wise person in contrast. So the wise person, Jesus says, hears his words and acts on the words. He's compared to a wise builder who built his house on a rock, and the house didn't fall when there was stress put on it from a storm. The foundation was firm, it was solid, and it was on Christ. What's interesting to note here, though, I saw in a commentary, is that both men heard Jesus' words and then did something, right? They're compared to people that did something. So both men did build houses, but where they built or how they built their houses was drastically different. And so they even looked similar, most likely. These could be two very similarly built houses, but it doesn't matter how similar they looked, because when the storm came, one had a bad foundation that couldn't handle the stress of the storm. And so the wise person is somebody who hears Jesus' words and puts them into practice. And they have hope. As we see in the false teachers and the false prophets, they've always been in this world. And Jesus was talking about them previously. And if you put your hope in false prophets, if you put your hope in people's empty words that are not God's truth, but they're worldly wisdom at best, then you can expect a foundation that will crumble at any sign of stress and will have cracks in it, any sign of stress or difficulty. And so going back to my situation in the hospital when the doctor told me this is serious and explained to me that my wife could die, I was crushed, but all that I could do was remember these two builders and remember that in this storm, God was there. In this difficult time, God was there, and He was the only one who I had. If my wife were here or if she were gone, that I had God. And that was all the peace and all that I needed to get through that difficult time. And so that was a very difficult time, and thankfully she lived. But to get to that realization of realizing if you were to lose something that you most cherish tomorrow, or it were to call into question that you could lose it tomorrow or this very day, how would it affect you? Would your foundation crumble? Or would you still stand firm on Christ and in Christ? And so the crowds were amazed at Jesus' teaching, which is this last part. Jesus didn't speak like the Pharisees and the religious leaders. He didn't refer to other rabbis and what they had to say. He didn't refer to others' opinions. He didn't have to speculate or conjecture. He knew and spoke his Father's will, and therefore he spoke absolute truth. And this is an interesting thing, because throughout history there have always been people who have led others astray. In Jeremiah, there were people who were renowned for telling people, "You'll be fine. Everything's fine." When Jeremiah had to explain to everybody that no, they were going to be judged. And I think there are always going to be people that tickle, even Paul talks about this in the New Testament later, but the people that'll tickle your fancies, and they'll tell you what you want to hear or what the world wants to hear. That is not God's truth. There is worldly wisdom, and then there is godly wisdom. And when Christ spoke, he spoke with godly wisdom. And so some final questions for today. What would you cling to if you lost everything tomorrow? What is your foundation? Is Christ your rock? Do you hear his teachings and do them, like the wise man? Or do you hear his teachings and do something else, like the foolish builder? Do you marvel at his wisdom or at someone else's opinions? Do you speak to others using his truth, or do you speak to others with worldly wisdom? I pray this message finds you well, and that you are clinging to the rock each day. God bless, and I will see you in the next reflection.